Good
Okay.
morning, esteemed speakers and participants. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this two-part webinar series that explores unknown aspects of Jain history. I am Sanchari, fellow at the India Center, Flame University. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to the host and chair of the India Center, Professor Pankaj Jain. Over to you, Professor Jain.
Thank you, Sanchari. Thank you for your help for organizing this webinar. For the first time, we are doing back-to-back two webinars by our esteemed guests from Ghent University in Belgium, which has suddenly emerged as a major center for Jain studies in Europe. And we are very, very privileged and honored to have them here at Flame University campus. So to begin, I'll start with reading the bio for Professor Eva De Clercq, who is the Associate Professor at Ghent University, Belgium. Her courses include all levels of Sanskrit and Prakrit, including Apabhransh and Classical Hindi, as well as South Asian literature and South Asian religious traditions. Her main research interests are the Jain versions of the Indian epics, especially in Apabhransha, and later medieval and early modern Digambar history. The first volumes of a translation of Swayambhu Deva's Ācārya has been published in the Murthy Classical Library of India at Harvard University Press as Life of Padma. So today she's going to speak for us on the Jain Mahābhāratas. Welcome, Professor Eva. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I hope the presentation works. Yeah. So I will start with an overview of what I will talk about. I'm sort of assuming that both Mahabharata and Jainism don't need too much introduction for you, but I mean, I will address some scholarly issues nonetheless, and then look at the, focus more on this Jain Mahābhāratas. So first and foremost, of course, I want to thank the professors Pankaj Jain, Devendra Jain, and Sanchari Chaudhary for giving me this opportunity to address you all. I've been working on the subject of Jain Mahābhāratas and Rāmāyaṇas for many years now. I mean, I tend to switch between both of them. Yeah, so let us begin with an introduction to the Mahabharata. So again, I assume it is well known to most of you. Mahabharata means a lot of things to a lot of people. First of all, it's a story.
Can I just jump in and tell you that we see your notes, not the slide?
Oh crap! Sorry, sorry. That was not. Oh yeah. Oh, is this better?
Yes, but there's still not full screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone know how to do the full
Yes,
screen?
now we can see the full screen.
Now it's full screen.
But now I can't see my notes.
Right.
Okay, then I'll have to kind of not go by the notes and just address what's on the slides without the... Oh, sorry, I'm just not all too good with these. Anyway, I'll go over the slides then. So it will not be the fluid prose that I had in my notes, but anyway, that doesn't matter. So Mahabharata, I mean, if you, the most common translation of the title is that it, it's translated as the story of the great. You have Maha there, and then war between brackets because the war is not, it's not mentioned in the title, of the descendants of Bharata. So this Bharata with a short this Bharata is considered kind of like a forefather. I mean, he is the forefather of the two warring parties in the Mahabharata, and at the same time, he is the Bharata, according to some, after whom, Bharat or India is known or is named. So a lot of scholars have worked on the Mahabharata, and there are differing opinions on its genesis. Most scholars tend to agree that there are many different layers in this Mahabharata, but the story in it as a whole is attributed to Vyasa, who at the same time is also a character in the story. But the word Vyasa itself, I mean, literally means the compiler, right? So you kind of get the suggestion that you know, this is a character that has been introduced as, yeah, but this was basically referring to, yeah, redactors of the story. It is or it was in, you know, when colonial in the colonial period, when interest rose in classical Sanskrit literature, it was termed a classical Sanskrit epic, and in that sense it was often twinned with the Rāmāyaṇa. And it's the kind of the reason for that is because, of course, in the West, or in the Greek tradition, you also have these two Homeric epics, and it was quite easy for European scholars to find in India, you know, oh, there's one epic, oh, and look, here is another epic, but we will come back to that in a minute. And at the center of this Mahabharata is a fratricidal war. Sometimes it's also called a Holocaust, where basically, yeah, mankind is kind of almost wiped out, and it all begins with this war between two clans of the same family, who then gather around them all the peoples of North India. So coming back to that link between Mahabharata and Rāmāyaṇa, I mean, there are obvious reasons for twinning them. And the first one being, of course, that they are what in Western terms would be called epic, in the sense that they are the stories of warriors. Yeah, there is a war at the center of both of them, warriors and heroes. But there's also important differences between the two. On the one hand, the Mahabharata tends to have this suggestion of being dangerous, of being taboo, and one of the sayings is that you should not have a complete set of the Mahabharata text in your house, because it might generate, you know, war or strife within your family. There's this danger associated with it, whereas the Rāmāyaṇa is generally considered to be the more auspicious work. At this, you know, what is paralleled here is that they both kind of tell the story or the lineage of these legendary royal dynasties of kind of, yeah, Indian lore. The Mahabharata tells the story of the lunar dynasty, or the Soma Vamsha, it's generally called, whereas then Rāmāyaṇa is all about the kings of the solar dynasty, so the Surya Vamsha, the Ikshvaku Vamsha, etc., with King Rama and then his predecessors and his followers. There's also, you know, the characters, these Vaishnava characters, divinities that are present in the story in both the epics. So there is Rama in the Rāmāyaṇa, who is a Vishnu avatar, and Krishna in the Mahabharata is introduced there. This is the first time in Indian history that the character of Krishna pops up. And what both also have in common is that the stories of these epics were frequently adapted in later art, be it pictorial art, performance art, and also in literature, of course. And this is how we come to the Jains and to the Jain version. So Jain universal history is where we find the characters of the Rāmāyaṇa and the Mahābhārata. Just a brief introductory slide about Jainism. Jainism is a religious tradition that arose in the Ganges plains, Gangetic plains, so in northeastern India. It's a so-called Shramanic religion, just as Buddhism is. And what does that mean, a Shramanic religion? Well, that the ideal of asceticism is very much at the center of it. That doesn't mean that all the Jains are ascetics or want to be ascetics, but the ideal, at least this kind of detachment from the material world, is something that is strived after. The founding character, you could say, of Jainism is Mahavira. Mahavira, you could compare him to, the Buddha. He was a most probably historical character who lived circa 6th century before the Common Era. But according to the Jains, he is not, the founder of Jainism. They consider him actually the last in a long line of 24 Jinas, or Tirthankaras as they are called, who spread the eternal dharma of Jainism. And the central vow, or the central principle of Jainism, is this vow of ahimsa, of non-violence. And I mean, when I describe Jainism to our students in Ghent, I tend to, they take Buddhism is much better known than Jainism. Buddhism also has this focus on meditation, at least, and on also non-violence is also there, and this mindfulness. This is very similar in Jainism, only that Jainism kind of takes it one step further, you could say. So that it is non-violence, but just a step further. So how does this translate? Well, there is, the Jain diet that excludes animal products. A popular image of Jains is, for instance, that of Jain monks and nuns who wear the mukhpati, this kind of a piece of cloth, and they walk around with a broom and brushing the earth before they put their foot down, in order not to crush any innocent small creatures or insects. And same for the mukhpati, they use this so that to avoid breathing in any small insects. And incidentally, this mukhpati is actually not used by the great majority of Jain monastic traditions, but it's still a popular image. That's why I mention it. But I think that's kind of the most important elements of Jainism. Now, the Jains have something that has been termed by Western scholars, again, the Jain universal history. This term universal history comes from the German Universalgeschichte, basically it's a, you could call it legendary, mythological, or traditional history, historiography of the universe. So this is the idea that the universe is subject to time cycles. So this is cyclical. You have periods, you have an upward kind of movement of time, and then a downward movement of time. During the upward movement of time, the situation gets better for the people. It goes from the most negative situation to the best, to kind of a climax, and then it goes down again in this in the second half cycle. Now, in this, according to, so in each cycle, in every half cycle, actually, you have 63 great men called Mahapurushas that live at that time, and it's kind of their stories, their biographies that make up this universal history. So these 63 great men are the 24 Tirthankaras. You could call them kind of prophets, who are born, who decide to renounce the world and then go and proclaim the Jain religion among the people. In addition to these 24 Tirthankaras, so they live successively, yeah, and they never live at the same time. In addition to that, we have 12 Chakravartins. Chakravartin is a character that also occurs in the Hindu traditions, in the Buddhist traditions. They are it's generally translated as universal emperor. They're political rulers, basically, who managed to conquer the 6 parts of Bharata, so actually the entire civilized world, you could say. Some of these are actually later become Tirthankaras, and others are, I mean, they're always very closely associated to the Tirthankaras themselves. So you have these, and then you have 9 sets of 9 triads, 9 sets of 3 of a Baladeva, Vasudeva, and a Prativasudeva. And the 9th, actually, the last set, and for those of you who, you know, who come from the Hindu traditions or the Indic traditions, you probably recognize the names of Baladeva, but certainly Vasudeva. Vasudeva is a well-known epithet for Krishna. And then the Prativasudeva is just, you could call that the anti-Krishna. So these characters are very much, how to say, you know, the blueprint of these stories of these 9 Baladevas, Vasudevas, and Prativasudevas is very much the story of Krishna. So the Baladeva is Balarama, the half-brother of Krishna, in the 9th set, and the Vasudeva is then Krishna himself, and the Prativasudeva, or their enemy, is Jarasandha. So it's not Kamsa, as you might have guessed, but it's actually Jarasandha. So this same blueprint is also projected on the 8th set of Baladeva, Vasudeva, Prativasudeva, and that is in fact Rama, Lakshmana, and Ravana. So the Balarama. So here what is interesting in the Jain tradition is that Krishna and Rama are not put on kind of on the same level. Actually, here Rama is put on the same level as Balarama. Because he's the elder brother, and then the younger half brother is then Krishna or Lakshmana, and their enemy is Ravana. And so these stories as a whole are told in, or we find them in texts in literature, and these texts in the Jain tradition are called Puranas. And in that sense, again, they offer kind of a counter tradition to those popular Hindu Puranas, you know, which really became very impactful from around the Gupta period. So it was kind of a measure, you could say, by the Jains to kind of have their own Purana. So Purana is a term used, and also Charita or Charitra, meaning something like biography. Okay, so yeah. So when we talk about the, I mean, the title of the talk is on Jain Mahābhāratas, and I haven't really addressed Mahābhāratas yet. And I will come to that now, because of course in the Mahabharata, as I already mentioned, you have this character of Krishna. And it's in fact in the stories, or related to the stories of the 9th Baladeva, Vasudeva, and Prativasudeva, that we also find the story of the Pandavas. And you see some kind of distinct, some different forms of this Mahabharata occur in the Jain tradition. So we find so-called Jain prototype or prototypical form of the Mahabharata already in the Jaina Āgama. So the Jaina Āgama, or the canonical texts, these are considered the actual words of Mahavira, of the last Tirthankara. As you may know, in Jainism, there's actually 2 big groups, right? It's called sects. You have the Shvetambaras and the Digambaras. The main difference between the 2 groups is that the Digambaras, the monks of the Digambara tradition, they are nude, they don't wear any clothes, they have no possessions, and the monks of the Shvetambara tradition, I mean, it's all in the name, the ones who are who are dressed in white, they wear a white garment. So this division between the two is something that grew historically. And one of the main differences also between the two is that according to the Digambaras, the entire canon, so the words of Mahavira, once existed, it was once compiled, but over history it has gone, it became lost. So we don't have the original canon anymore, according to them. Now, according to the Shvetambaras, there is indeed a set of texts, according to them, that survived and that actually can be traced back directly to Mahavira. And a part of this, in some of these texts, indeed, we find reference to Mahabharata or Mahabharata characters, including Krishna. Yeah. So in the Uttara Sutra, for instance, this is a very popular part of the Āgamas, which contains lots of stories. And one of the stories narrated there is that of the 22nd Tirthankara. So the one before Mahavira, who was called Neminatha or Arishta Nemi. And he is in fact a cousin of Krishna, the younger cousin of Krishna. And we find there, so here we have this association with Krishna, which is very interesting. And we find in this story that Krishna, in fact, was instrumental to Neminatha becoming a Tirthankara, in the sense of his, deciding to renounce the world. So how the story goes is that this Arishta Nemi, he was a young prince growing up at the court. His older cousin Krishna saw that this young man was kind of, was very mighty and very powerful. And according to some versions of the story, Krishna was getting a bit nervous because Krishna, he was the big hero in the family. And he didn't like it that, there was this youngster there who might, end up being stronger than him. Of course, Krishna had some kind of insight in this, again suggested in some of the stories, into what might happen. And Krishna then says, okay, what needs to happen now is that Nemi needs to get married. So he arranges the wedding to Rajimati. And then, while the preparations are going on, Krishna takes his nephew around. He puts him in the chariot, and he takes his nephew or his cousin around in the around the city to show him all the preparations for the wedding. Now, as part of these preparations are, of course, animals that will be slaughtered for the wedding feast. And these animals are wailing, they're crying because they know that they will soon die. And Nemi is so touched by this, by the sight of these animals, that he then and there decides to renounce the world, that he no longer wants to take part in the kind of the material world. And he leaves his bride at the altar, you could say, and he goes and becomes an ascetic, and then attains this omniscience, and he becomes the Tirthankara who will spread the religion. So in that sense, Krishna is quite central to the story of Nemi. So this we find in the Uttara Sutra. Now, in one of the so this is just, I'm telling you this first because it's a very important story. It's not the oldest one. Actually, we have a very, one of the earliest, according to scholars, is the Antakridashanga, the Antagadadasanga in Prakrit, that contains all sorts of material. And in this, so there's also narratives being told in that text. And in fact, of all the chapters, of all the life stories about, renunciation, 5 of these chapters are actually about relatives, or described as relatives of Krishna. So including the famous story of Gajya Sukumara, which is again very interesting, that this character of Krishna somehow seems to be included in or kind of drawn into this early Jaina lore. And then you have this Jñātri Dharmakatha, the Naya Dhammakahao in Prakrit, that really very much focuses also on Krishna, where Krishna is described as the king of Dwarka. So this is in the later part, you could say, of the biography of Krishna. And here you have this, the first focus or the first mention of the Pandavas, right? In the Jain story of Draupadi. So Draupadi, you probably know, is a character that throughout South Asian history, you know, I mean, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of issues about the Mahabharata, and the character of Draupadi is one, especially her being married to 5 husbands, right? We have different accounts of the story. Even in the Mahabharata itself, there's you know, there's all of these issues going on, that it's kind of accidental that Draupadi actually, you know, was supposed to be married only to Arjuna, but it's because of some misunderstanding from Kunti's side that she then ends up being married to all of the Pandavas. And I mean, you know, it's been a topic of debate. And of course, also for the Jains. So what we find here in this canonical text is a first version of the reason why Draupadi, according to some, was married to 5 husbands. And in a typically Jain way, this is, you know, this is due to Draupadi's previous life. Everything is due to your karma and to your, you know, what you did in your previous lives. And according to this account here in the Āgama, Draupadi in a previous life was a Jain nun. I mean, there's different life stories that are being told, but I'm just summarizing to the main one. So she is a Jain nun. She is in the forest on the outskirts of a city. She is meditating, and one day she sees a courtesan just, you know, passing by in the distance, and this courtesan is being wooed by 5 different men. And what happens to the nun Draupadi is that she is overcome by an ardent desire. This is also a theme that is quite popular in the Jain tradition. It's called a nidana. A nidana is a very strong desire that will really affect your next life. So she has this nidana, this very strong desire, you know, to also receive such attention from different men. And it's actually this nidana, when this nun dies, that causes her in her next life to, you know, have 5 husbands. This is what is told in that story there. In addition, there's also a story of Draupadi being abducted. And so in that sense, even though the focus is on Draupadi, of course, the Pandavas are mentioned and are there. So this is kind of the main the main presence of the Pandavas in the Jain Āgamas. So what did we remember from this is we have this connection. It's Krishna is very much present there. Krishna is the cousin of Neminatha. So you have the characters of Neminatha, his biography that is told. In addition to that, we have Krishna, and then we have also the Pandavas. So yeah, I didn't mention that. So Krishna is the king of Dwarka, and one day, like in the Vyasa Mahabharata, or in the Vyasa, no, it's in the Harivam Shapurana, the Pandavas actually come and visit him in Dwarka. And so that is the occasion when the story of Draupadi is actually told. So these are interlinked, right? Krishna, you have the Pandavas, you have Nemi. And that is kind of the prototype that is taken over in the earliest tradition after that. So yeah, moving on. Before I move on, it's important to mention that actually, whereas Krishna and the Pandavas are very much present in the Jain Āgama, Rama is not. Rama and the story of the Rāmāyaṇa are completely absent. There is no mention, no reference to them. The only reference that is there is that Rama, Lakshmana, and Ravana are the 8th Baladeva, Vasudeva, Prativasudeva. So it's just, I mean, it's an interesting contrast, one could say. So coming to the post-canonical literature, we have authors writing, you know, the universal history, writing the Puranas, and one of the very early ones is in fact a Harivam Shapurana. It's a Digambara work dated to the 8th century AD and situated in southern Gujarat by Jinasena Punata. So it's a work in 66 chapters, and within this entire work, so if you get the title Harivam Shapurana, the focus of is really, I mean, the title is quite clear that the focus is on Krishna and the story of Krishna, of these Baladeva, Vasudeva, Prativasudeva. So Krishna and his relationship to Neminatha and the biography of Neminatha, those are kind of the more prominent ones, stories told here. And in addition to that, there are some chapters that deal with the Pandava story. So again, it's yeah, it's on a similar occasion, Krishna one day receives a visit from the Pandavas, and he invites them to tell their story. So then they begin to tell their story about, you know, about the problems with the Kauravas, the Lekker House incident, how they, etc., etc. You know, the game of dice, the banishment to the forest. But it's very brief, it's very condensed. It's just in a few hundred verses that it's narrated in this Harivam Shapurana. What is furthermore very interesting here is that the battle of Kurukshetra, which in the Vyasa Mahabharata, and as we all know it best, is the great war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, right? Now, what Jinasena does is he kind of transforms this battle into the war between the Vasudeva and the Prativasudeva. So the war in Kurukshetra isn't, I mean, you have the same factions, it's the same parties who do the fighting, but instead of it being the Pandavas and the Kauravas, you have Krishna, who has the Pandavas on his side, fighting against Jarasandha, who has the Kauravas on his side. So that is in fact what happens there. But of course, it's the same kind of, the outcome is the same, so to say, you know, that the Pandavas prevail and Jarasandha and his, you know, allies, they die. Yeah, so this is then another work where you find this story of, in a very similar way, is the Uttara Purana of Gunabhadra. This is better known as a kind of, you could call it almost a supplement to the Adi Purana by Jinasena. This is another Jinasena than the Jinasena Punata. He is from the south, from Malkhet, Manyaketa. And of Jinasena, we know that he was associated with the Rashtrakuta court in the 9th century. So yeah, roughly 100 years after Jinasena Punata. So this Jinasena and Gunabhadra, they composed together what is called the Mahapurana. So Jinasena wrote the Adi Purana, Gunabhadra wrote the Uttara Purana, and together this is the Mahapurana. And this is basically the entire universal history of the Jains. So it contains the stories in condensed form, of course. It contains the stories of all the 24 Tirthankaras, the 12 Chakravartins, and all the 9 triads. And included there is also the story of Neminatha and the story of the 9th Baladeva, Vasudeva, Prativasudeva. And within that, as again a smaller part, just a few verses, we have this reference to the story of the Pandavas. So it's very brief here. So the first two, I mean, this is, you know, this is really, these are texts that could be considered like literature. It's kind of a kavya. And we have, so the first two were Digambara, then we come in time, the first Shvetambara text, that is also a Mahapurana, but this one is composed in Prakrit and Maharashtri is Sri Lanka or Shilacharya's Chaupana Mahapurisa. So the biography of the Chaupana of the 54 Mahapurushas. So the difference here is that Sri Lanka, or at least his tradition, doesn't count the Prativasudevas as Mahapurusha. So hence you have, according to his reckoning, only 54 and not 63. He also hailed from Gujarat and lived there in the 9th century. So this is poetically, it's a very, from a literary point of view, it's a very interesting text. It contains some of the accounts of some Mahapuranas, even in a dramatic form, so as a theater play. And it also has a kind of a sizable account of Neminatha with some references to the Pandavas in there. So this is kind of, these are the earliest ones. The next one in line is perhaps better known. I didn't mention it here because I just wanted to, give the earlier ones. From the 12th century, you have, of course, Hemachandra's Trishashti Shalaka Purusha Charita, which follows this Sri Lanka tradition. So we're here in the 9th century with Sri Lanka, and then around this time you see some innovations, you could say, in these Jain Mahābhāratas. So negotiating the prototype. And here we come to, the texts that I prefer to work on in Apabhramsha, and the author, the Apabhramsha author by whom we have the first attested works is Swayambhudeva. There were authors before him, but none of the works have survived. And Swayambhudeva composed, among others, both a Jain version of the Rāmāyaṇa and a Jain version of the Mahabharata, or this, and that is called the Ritanimi Charyu, or the Charyu means is Charita, the biography of Ritanimi, and that is Arishtanimi. So the title would make us think that this is in fact the story of this 22nd Tirthankara, right? Now that is certainly included there, but in fact the title itself is a bit misleading, because in fact what we have here is that Swayambhu, he really deviates from this pattern where you have the focus on Neminatha and Krishna, and then as a kind of a sub-narrative, we have the Pandava story. He switches it around. So this is very much all about the Pandavas, about the Mahabharata. So Swayambhu also belonged to the 9th, 10th century, from a Kannada-speaking area that we know, but probably rather to the north. So the area of Nashik, which is very much Maharashtra now, but in historically, the area of the Kannada-speaking area was much larger than what is now the state of Karnataka. It reached up much further north. So he composes in Apabhramsha, and indeed this work is mostly Mahabharata. So it's a work of, I think, 105 chapters in total. And for the most part, so from chapter 31 to 33 to 91, this is called the vast Yudhakanda, and it gives the story of the 18-day war of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And what is interesting is that there is none of this transformation of the Kurukshetra war being about Krishna versus Jarasandha. No, it's very much the same story, the same format as we find it in Vyasa's Mahabharata. So it's the same character, it's the same order of events here, only slightly differentiated with some Jain, the characters being Jain, basically, but that really doesn't alter the events as they happen. So it's all about the war and about the consequences, the terrible consequences of war. And that in itself, it's been said about the Vyasa Mahabharata that the main rasa is the Shanta Rasa, because it kind of, you know, it is so terrible that really it causes the audience to want to detach from the world, which is very much, you know, in kind of in line with these Jain norms of striving for this asceticism and detaching from the material world. And yeah, the patron, there is a patron mentioned, a certain Dhavalaya. We know nothing of him. We know, I mean, all of the patrons of Swayambhu have this suffix of Aya, as we have them now also still in Karnataka for these people, you know, the Kannadigas. So this is a first, yeah, innovative form, you could say, that despite the title really very much deals with the Pandava Charita. Now in the, this is, I'm just taking it chronologically. So possibly, you know, within decades from Swayambhu, we have also in the Kannada language and some what further to the south of Swayambhu, a very famous work called the Vikramarjuna Vijaya by Pampa. You know, Pampa is one of the great poets of classical Kannada literature. And he wrote a work, even though Pampa himself was a Jain, he wrote a version of the Mahabharata that really has very, I mean, it's a generic, you could call it a generic Mahabharata that has nothing specifically Jain about it. Of course, this is also debated. I mean, there are some scholars who say, yeah, in some of the details you find some Jain elements there, but it's not explicitly Jain, where you have the inclusion of a Nimi Charita, or where you have this narrative frame of the Jain universal history. So this is quite interesting. You know, why would a Jain author decide to abstain from this Jain narrative, even though it is there? Yeah. Now Pampa, he wrote explicitly for a patron, a king, a royal patron, King Arikesari, and he explicitly also parallels this king with Arjuna. Arjuna, as you know, is the great warrior, right? He is the kind of the macho, or the most manly of all the Pandavas. And now this work, this Vikramarjuna Vijaya, was a subject of study of Sheldon Pollock, and quite central to his to some of his thoughts on you know, the regionalization and this kind of how this, you know, the epics, especially the Mahabharata, kind of came to be localized in the different regions, and then here in the Kannada-speaking region. So he says that refashioning a Sanskrit epic discourse on power, and he calls it a re-envisioning of the old trans-regional political order for another very different kind of world. So this is, according to him, also one of the reasons why Pampa chose not to follow a Jain narrative, but chose to follow the Vyasa Mahabharata because of its political implications. Now, yeah, what's important is that Pampa was actually not the only one to, the only Jain to compose a non-Jain Mahabharata, even though Jain versions are there. We have another poet who does a very similar thing in 13th century Gujarat, so a few centuries later, and that is Amarachandra and his Bala Bharata. Now, this is a notorious work, as you know, it's described as Mahakavya, as a really very courtly poetry, and it completely follows the story of Vyasa. So it has no Jain traits whatsoever. It's divided into 18 books, and it explicitly mentions as patrons the Brahmins of Vagada. So we have no royal patronage here, but Brahmin patronage, interestingly. And to kind of complicate this, we have around the same time of Amarachandra, the next slide, also in Gujarat, slightly earlier, we have Devaprabha Suri, who writes the Pandava Charita, which indeed follows the Jain prototype. So it's the Pandava Charita, the focus is on the story of the Pandavas, but it includes the story of Neminatha and that story of Krishna as the 9th Vasudeva. It's also, like Amarachandra's work, divided into 18 chapters, so 18 books. And you see an attempt here by the author of to kind of fuse different traditions, to kind of find common ground. I mentioned this here. I myself have not really done research on the Pandava Charita. It is one of our PhD students in Ghent, Simon Wienand, is actually focusing on this text, and he discovered that there is a lot of literal borrowing from Vyasa. So actually pieces from the Mahabharata, important parts of the text are literally, transplanted within this Pandava Charita, sometimes in a different context. I mean, this intertextuality here is very interesting. So there's literal borrowing from Vyasa, and at the same time also from Hemachandra, that great predecessor of Devaprabha Suri, who was also from the same area of Gujarat. So yeah, this is, I think, this was kind of just my overview. There's many more versions of the Jain Mahābhārata or the Jain Harivamsha that are around and that circulate. Another former student from Ghent University is working on a version in Braj Bhasha that comes from actually from Rajasthan. Which has its own kind of interesting characteristics in the character of Draupadi, and then these Sati characters that come to the fore. And consider this presentation as kind of an invitation to have a look at these texts. They have a lot to offer, and they, there's a lot of them still around, and a lot of work that still needs to be done. So yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm open to questions. If anyone has a question, I see in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Eva.
Welcome.
Okay, we have a early question from Tarini. Yeah.
Tarini, hello.
Yeah, I think you can unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I think I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes. Right.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk. So a lot of the Jaina texts that you talked about, some of them, especially the later ones, were kavyas of some kind. And like you said, the plot in the kavya often follows, or at least sometimes follows Vyasa rather than the Jaina narrative. I was curious as to how you think that world relates to the world of aesthetics, where people like Anandavardhana are saying that, well, it's okay to change up the plot if it's better for rasa. So just how does it relate to the larger aesthetic world?
Yeah, that's an interesting point and an interesting approach, of course. That might also, I mean, as far as I know, neither Pampa nor Amarachandra are explicit about, whether kind of aesthetics was the reason why they changed, why they kind of stepped away from the Jain story. But it would be very interesting to look at it from that point of view. I hadn't thought about it, so thank you for this suggestion. I think it's a really good one, because we often tend to look at texts and think, oh, this is a Hindu text, oh, this is a Jain text, and really focus on it, look at it through like a religious identity thing, whereas it being kavya,
Right.
form is often, I mean, or not form, but aesthetic effect is superior to kind of, I don't know, adhering to any tradition, or at least there is a kind of tension there. So it's really interesting that you make that point. I think it would be good to have a look at these texts through that lens.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Professor Tarini Avasthi, she teaches a course from the Mahabharata at Flames, so very
Yeah.
relevant from her. Any other question before I ask my Sanjay, go ahead.
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Professor Eva. That was so much knowledge for me today. So this is coming from rather one of my students' assignments, I would say. So at the start of the presentation, you mentioned that Jainism, at the heart of the Jainism lies the ethos of asceticism. But also we know the Jain community as one of the affluent communities. So how does one reconcile to the fact that it is focusing both on asceticism and materialism, probably?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that it looks very kind of like a paradox, right? I do, and this is something that scholars have also thought about, but the one does not have to exclude the other. You could say that the focus is on the ideal of the ascetic who renounces the world, but at the same time, not everyone needs to become an ascetic. And also ascetics to be, yeah, it sounds strange to say, to speak of an ascetic as successful, but for them to be able to attain their goal of detachment of the world, they need support of the community. Historically, they always needed the support of the community. And in many texts, you find that, I mean, there is this general Indian thing also of the Purusharthas, right? Of Dharma, Artha, Kama, and then sometimes moksha is added there. And that's also present in Jainism. There is this kind of balance that needs to be there. Not so much for the ascetics. I mean, they have their goal, and that is going through this, the gunastanas and reaching enlightenment. They are very much self-centered in a way, but also, I mean, part of the Jain doctrine is that you have these different parts of the community. Jainism is not only about ascetics. You have 4 parts of the community, and these are the monks, the nuns, and then the laymen and the lay women, and all of them are part of the community and are equally important in the community, and they should all be there. Because if one of them is missing, then there is no support for the Jain Dharma anymore. So and of course, yeah, traditionally all kinds of reasons are given for why the Jain community is such an affluent community. Historically, sometimes what is mentioned is that, because of this ahimsa vow that Jains were never allowed to actually work with living materials, so things like farming was not was considered by some to be not appropriate. But at the same time, you do have Jain farmer communities. There is also no one Jainism historically. There's a lot of variation also there. What we do find interestingly, for instance, in Belgium, where I come from, we have also an affluent Jain community in the Antwerp diamond business. And I found it quite striking that in some of the earliest inscriptions in Mathura that you find of the Jain inscriptions, that it is mentioned that actually the lay person who sponsored, I don't know, was it an installation of an image or something, or a temple, that he was a dealer in Mani Ratna, so in gems. So this I don't know if it's necessarily linked to the doctrine, or the two were kind of intertwined, but somehow the Jainism kind of was adopted by these merchant communities. I think in a similar way also to Buddhism in the early period. It seemed to have been these Vaishya communities, these Banyas, who decided to kind of, and all kinds of explanations are there. But I mean, that said, you know, there are the Jain tradition is very rich in narratives, and there's many narratives about Jain merchants. Probably more narratives about Jain merchants than about Jain kings.
Right. Thank you, Professor.
Welcome.
Thank you. Any other question by any other attendees? If not, I have a small question. Maybe we have, I think, 4 minutes before our next presentation by Professor Tine. My question is, what exactly happens to all the gruesome carnage of violence that is happening in the Mahabharata? Does it get genofied somehow? All the violence becomes non-violence? How? If yes, then how?
It's this kind of, I mean, it's like in the Jain Ramayana. I mean, I'm better acquainted with the Jain Ramayanas, but it's very simple. There's a lot of, and I was surprised, you know, as at 22 starting to read these Jain Ramayanas, I sort of assumed that it's going to be full of lectures on how not to be violent, but it's not. There's so much violence in there, but at the same time, there's the message of how gruesome and how, you know, it does kind of, you know, like watching a horror movie might kind of make you think, oh, all the blood and gore, and then this idea of bringing you into a state that you, oh no, I don't want anything to do with the physical world anymore. I mean, this is, and sometimes it's mentioned explicitly, you know, that some person is lamenting the death of someone, and it's, oh, look, and how this physical body and how terrible and how it's smelly and whatever. And we should focus on, you know, on our jiva, on our soul, and really go for the kind of personal transformation and you know, our karmic state.
Yes. Tarini, you have a point to add or ask?
I see, Tarini has a. Now I'm wondering if Ananda Varnana wasn't reading some of them. Maybe he was. I know. To be honest, I think for the Jain, except for Pampa and then this Mahabharata, I think that the readership, I have the impression that it is, you know, for the most part within the Jain community. Although I think, and Tarini, we discussed this yesterday, some of the elements do seem to creep into other texts. Yeah.
All right. Anybody else? All right. If not, I think let's get ready for our next presentation.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent, insightful presentation on several prototypes of Jain Mahābhārata and Krishna and so on. So Krishna is going to hell according to Jain text, right?
Yes.
But not Ram.
Not Ram, no. Krishna goes to hell, but in some future existence, he will be a Tirthankara. So it's not so bad.
Yes. All right. So our next presentation is by Professor Tine Vekemans. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Hopefully, okay. All right. So I'll start with reading her bio a little bit, and then she can take over. So Professor Tine Vekemans holds the prestigious Ācārya Mahāprajña Chair for Jain Studies at Ghent University, also in Belgium. Her work on contemporary Jainism and Jainism outside of South Asia combines textual and anthropological methods and approaches Jainism from the day-to-day experiences and practices of Jains. Her courses include Modern History of South Asia, Society and Current Affairs of South Asia, and specialist seminars on migration, modernity, contemporary Jainism, and Jain texts in Hindi and Gujarati. That's quite enormous areas to cover. So all yours, Professor. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can share my screen as it should be shared.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Right from the start.
Yeah,
okay. So thank you very much, Professor Jain. It's lovely to be here. We've been spending a couple of days on the campus of Flame, and we've been enjoying the tranquility a lot. It does indeed make room for taught and work and writing, and luckily also for presenting. So I wanted to start very briefly by telling you a little bit more about my approach to Jain studies, as Eva and I are close colleagues and share sort of our Sanskrit teachers, and Eva taught me some Prakrit as well. But my approach to Jainism is much less literature and text-centered than Professor De Clercq, than Eva's is. I work mainly on contemporary Jainism, and the basis of my research so far has always really been ethnographic. I start from the experience and the practices of Jains themselves, and now in approaching Jain migration history, the memories of Jains and Jain families, rather than from doctrine or text. That is not to say that text isn't present in my research at all, as you will see in today's presentation. So these are my two most recent publications. Digital and Diaspora is a book based on my PhD research, which came out of Ergon, and then earlier this year, a chapter appeared in Living Folk Religions, a volume by Routledge. And it's in an interesting way connects to my talk today. So if you're interested in the concept of Jain mendicants and mendicant-like figures being present outside of South Asia, then I will direct you to this volume where you can read my encounters with a sadhu that came for lunch in Atlanta, and which puzzled me greatly. And puzzlement and kind of not understanding a situation can be really powerful, sort of in coming to an understanding, can be a really powerful methodological moment. Right. Before I get started with my talk of today, I want to recognize the input of some of my colleagues and friends. The text that I will be reading from today was found in a manuscript collection by Professor John Court, who just had time to take a picture of the first page before he had to leave. Then Eric Villalobos, currently at Emory University, went back to scan the entire thing, for which we're very thankful, and is also here today, I think. He also sort of talked me through the type of mendicant the author of this text is. So I'm leaning very heavily on his work. And then you have some people based in East Africa, in Kenya mostly, like Pushpendra Shah, who is the person in charge of a large Facebook group called the Osho Memory Project, and people based in London, such as Hashmita Shah, who you see in the picture, and Professor Atul Shah, who actually gave a talk for Flame earlier this year on Indic finance, together with Devendra Jain, Professor Devendra Jain, with whom I have an ongoing Jain migration history project. The title of my talk, as announced, is "Oh Maharaj, Take These Lemons." It's supposed to be a little bit of a puzzling title. I will, in the coming half hour, 45 minutes, I will talk you through these lemons, and by the end, I hope you will know what I'm talking about. It has two subtitles by now, it keeps on growing. Jains and Jainism in East Africa, but also a singularly interesting source text to learn about them. So let's jump in and try to figure out more about these lemons. With me stood a crowd of brothers and sisters who related their experiences of the sea by way of advice to me. "Oh Maharaj, take these lemons with you, because the sea gets very choppy." "Okay," I said in reply. Another said, "Yes, Maharaj, the food on the steamers is good at times, but not always. Fruit is good for this." I listened to everyone's advice. Amidst congratulations and well wishes, I proceeded to finalize formalities and was guided to the dock to board the steamer. Our passports were checked and our pictures taken. But security was less tight than we had expected. Perhaps our white robes caused the officials at the dock some surprise, and they dared not disturb us. Indeed, at 6 o'clock, we stepped onto the stairs of the steamer. On the one hand, I was going abroad for the propagation of religion. On the other, the enthusiasm of the crowd at the dock was like the motherland calling me back. As I boarded the steamer, I was conflicted. My heart was beating with the echoes of various futures, and my mind was restless. Everything I read is an English translation, which I made from a Gujarati original, and I am so very much to blame if there's any inaccuracies or problems with translation. I just need to add that kind of as a reminder. So what am I reading from? I am reading from a travelogue consisting of more than 400 pages in Gujarati, which was published in 1952 by a Jain organization in Gujarat. These 400 pages consist of some preliminary chapters, which are really quite sort of more in sort of the philosophy of culture, the philosophy of civilization, and then the philosophy of religion, called Light and Darkness, and then the currents of culture. It's interesting to see that this combines kind of a state of affairs of Jainism and of where the Jain society should be at this point in time when it is written, but it also more broadly thinks of ancient civilizations such as the one in India, but one in Mesopotamia and Egypt is also mentioned, and how they have fared throughout world history. So it's a really very broad introduction to what is essentially sort of the culture and civilization in the Western Indian Ocean. The travelogue then continues with accounts of some travels that the author did within India, to Malabar, to Kutch, and then comes to a Chaturmas passed in Karachi in 1945. The slide says it's actually 1944. I'm sorry for this inaccuracy. And then the next chapters give an account of travels to Aden and Addis Ababa, and then travels to the British East African territories, and then Uganda and other countries. If we put that on a map, we can see the most important locations which are mentioned in a travelogue. The light green ones in India, and what was British India, Karachi is now in Pakistan, of course, they're the main points of focus in India. Bombay, where the steamers leave, 2 steamers in this story, one to Aden and that Gulf of Aden region, and one to East Africa. Karachi, where the invitation to travel arrives, and Porbandar, which is where the Jain Sangh, the Jain organization is, which will eventually then publish this book. We see that in this first trip, Aden is the main location because the invitation comes from the Aden Shri Sangh, but Djibouti in Ethiopia, Abyssinia, as it is referred to in travelogue, are also visited. In the second trip, Mombasa is the first port of call because that is where the initial invitation came from. But the author actually visits locations in Kenya, in Uganda, which isn't really even on the map. I couldn't make it work, but also Tanzania and Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. So it is quite a busy schedule these days. Eva and I sometimes complain about how busy our days are in our 2.5-week trip to India, but they are perhaps nothing like as busy as the days of this author, who does this sort of 2 trips within a span of 11 months. What does he write about leaving and sort of the sense of going abroad? Familiar society has become accustomed to listening to sermons, meaning that they understand the practice of it. They do not take time to implement the sermon when it is done. While the unfamiliar society listens eagerly to the sermon, thinks carefully, and tries its best to implement it. This is why I've always accepted invitations from unfamiliar places. Who is this person writing? Who is this person sort of reminiscing and thinking about different audiences to give lectures to preach to, and the reaction of different audiences? The author is Yati Hemchandra, who is a member of a Yati lineage within the broader Lonka Gach, which sort of came to the fore in the 16th century. We don't have an exact date of birth or date of death. We do have an exact date for his Diksha under Yati Swarup Chandra, which was so done in April 1939. Now we know that this Yati Hemchandra, the author of the book that I am reading from to you, is a Gurubai of another Yati, Yati Rajchandra, who interestingly is one of the very few, if not only other, that we know of that have traveled outside of South Asia in that kind of time. Yati Rajchandra went to the other side, so not East Africa, but Southeast Asia. And I'm looking into finding dates and more details on those travels as well. Yati Hemchandra was quite influential. He was quite influential, giving speeches around time of independence as well, so religious but also political speeches. And he became the administrative head of the lineage after his guru Swarup Chandra died. So what's Yati? Some people will know, others might not. I spent a considerable time studying Jainism from a contemporary perspective without ever sort of encountering this category. But Yatis dominated Shvetambar Jainism in the early modern period, especially in Gujarat and Marwar, Rajasthan region. And they are mendicants. Often the title Yati and title Sadhu were used interchangeably, but Yatis are sort of, if anything makes them special, it's an alternative interpretation of the Jain monastic code. They take the 5 vows of a traditional Jain mendicant, but they are known to travel by vehicle, handle money, and engage in some cases in practical sciences like astrology, Ayurvedic medicine, and mantra making. Now I say in some cases because in the case of Yati Hemchandra, there's no indication that he really spends time on this kind of activities, but we'll get to that later. Now, from the 19th century, there's been some reforms in both the lay and mendicant Jain communities, and they have, by the mid-20th century, so by the time that we encounter Yati Hemchandra and he travels, these lineages are kind of almost at their end. They are nearly eliminated, not entirely though, and that is where Eric's research comes in. There are still some pockets, some lineages, some families of Yatis about, but as a tradition, as sort of fully initiated Yatis sitting on a gadi, on a sort of Yati seat, that is nearly completely eliminated and was already much in decline by the time Yati Hemchandra writes. So that makes this travelogue also very interesting from the point of view of the history of reform and counter-reform in Jainism, especially sort of Jainism of mendicants, ascetic Jainism, in that mid-20th century. And in the travelogue, we read about our Yati encountering others. I'll read you again. I spoke to him directly. Him, in this case, is a sadhu that he meets in Karachi, where he's spending his Chaturmas. Telling him that if he was willing, I would like to give a lecture with him. And before he writes this, he said that this is a sadhu that he heard a lot about and that is apparently a great scholar of languages. So he's actually looking forward. From his writing, you get the impression he's looking forward to this. But the response I got from him, he writes, was, "You are not worthy to lecture with us." I was sad. This was not worthy of a scholar of virtue, but a spectre of pride. When I asked why they looked at me with such hatred, the answer was, "We know Yatis. In Marwar, you people have spread much deception." When hearing this answer, I ceased making any further pleas or requests from this Muni. The Yati Sampradaya of Marwar, he writes a little bit later, has fallen out of favor with the public today. Gujarati Yatis, which is the kind of group that he is part of, should take care not to represent the mendicant values, of modesty and knowledge. On many occasions, such monks have undertaken to interrupt my lectures, but I will not go into that now, as I am unsure if I will even call them monks. It can be quite sharp in his writing. But for myself, I'm satisfied, and I don't deceive or try to make myself look special. I consider myself blessed. I'm a yati, I behave like a yati. If I were to do the work of a yati in the guise of a sadhu, and then he means a Samvegi sadhu, his criticism would apply. But as I do not, it doesn't. From this text, you clearly see that there's different groups involved. Hemchandra writes as a Gujarati yati. And he gets into this, not really an argument, there's clearly tension between him and this Samvegi sadhu, this what we now would call sort of the traditional sadhu. There's clearly a tension based on the Samvegi sadhu saying yatis, they are lax, they get into all of these kind of tantric behaviors which aren't worthy of a true mendicant. From his side, Hemchandra clearly sort of looks at the Samvegi sadhus and says, well, look at this pride, which isn't really worthy of Jain mendicant. Look at how they embrace sectarianism rather than approach the world from sort of a non-sectarian viewpoint. But then you also see, although in the travelogue he doesn't encounter any yatis from Marwar, he has sort of heard the sadhu's comments about the laxity and about sort of the tantric meddling of yatis, and says, well, but they're the ones from Marwar. And for him, clearly that sort of, they're bad publicity. And we will see later on that he could not steer more clear from mantra making and tantra and sort of healing activities if he tried, right? So he clearly distances himself from that. But we'll come back to the ideology that is clearly present in the travelogue later. First, I want to read to you guys some more from the text. I want to read to you how Yati Hemchandra gets an invitation to go and embark upon this quite impressive travel around the Western Indian Ocean. One day, a householder came to me and asked, Maharaj Shri, would you come to Mombasa? I was surprised. Mombasa? For a Jain Yati, this is indeed a matter of wonder, and I well understood what such an endeavor would mean. Going to Africa means crossing the ocean. But I was thrilled at the thought that the type of work that I'd been doing within India could be spread to Africa. The benefits I have received through listening to your lectures could also greatly benefit our Gujarati brothers who have settled there. And if you do not provide these brothers of ours living far away with such benefit, the word in Gujarati is labh, who will? That householder was Sri Bhagwanji Hansraj, the leading activist of the All-Africa Mombasa Sri Svetambar Deravasi Sangh. And the only picture I could find of him is actually a picture which is in the snack and sweet shop of his family even today in East Africa. So with that, the invitation has been delivered, and Yati Hemchandra describes how he starts looking at his options, how he tries to come to a decision of what to do. Because indeed, even though Yatis are known to have traveled by car, by train, by all kinds of transport, in 1944, when this invitation comes, crossing the ocean, boarding a steamer, still seems like a very, very unusual thing to do, even for them. But then also from the beginning, like he says, you read from the text, he wants to go. He wants to take them up on this invitation. He's already in previous chapters described how he feels that travel to lesser known regions within India, to Kutch, to Malabar, has greatly sort of expanded his horizon, and he finds it very satisfying and a very sort of a learning experience. So he writes, what's the current status of Jainism? What was once the religion of crores, today is not even that of lakhs. And how many cracks have appeared even within these lakhs? There is nothing left but cracks and strife between groups and subgroups, which has disintegrated the strength of the Jain society. I shuddered as I realized it all. How unreligious has the society that worships the non-violence of Mahavir become? Thoughts came to me and my mind began to spin. What would be the condition of the Jaina living far away? What will be the circumstances of the Shravaks in the world across the ocean, who have lived there for years? I wanted to see it all myself, but what would society say? So he ponders this, but in the end, he's in Karachi, he has to give lectures, and in the evening he goes to bed, and he hopes, I would assume, to have a good night's rest. But alas, this will not happen, because he has a very interesting dream in which a specter appears in his room and talks to him. What is the problem? Says this specter, says this ghost. I have traveled 3 times. I lectured as an expert on Pali languages at universities in Europe, and along with that, Jainism was propagated. The society there developed a curiosity about Jain philosophy. I converted many carnivores to vegetarianism and softened the hearts of the bloodthirsty, so spreading the glow of the lamp of knowledge far and wide, as it should be. I have presented to the world the precious knowledge which Mahavira gave to the world. I've broken the old system and abolished customs, and have spread the religion abroad. So what is stopping you? So no rest for Yati Hemchandra that night. The specter that visits him is Pandit Jinvijaiji speaking. Now, Pandit Jinvijaiji was a former monk who renounced mendicancy and set sail by sea in 1928 to different locations, but mostly to Europe. And he then went into education in Gujarat and other places. But in another place, in the travelogue, he, meaning the author, speaks more about Pandit Jinvijaiji. How the Jain community was in uproar when he left. People denounced his decision and even tried to prevent it. However, this opposition was caused by a lack of true understanding and a clinging to narrow personal beliefs. Discounting all that, Panditji traveled abroad, and let me tell you, if he had had the full support of our fortunate society, he would have been able to spread Jain literature, culture, and philosophy much more widely still. But society has always misunderstood such people, and it still does. And in the sharpness of how he writes this, you feel that he knows that he's going to encounter opposition, both within sort of lay society, and he's going to get backlash from parts of that mendicant society as well. He anticipates this. But still, he is quite clearly adamant about his decision. And on September 24th in 46, he boards the steamer for a second time. This time he already went to Aden. How he goes to Aden before Mombasa, I'll briefly tell you. It has everything to do with geopolitics at the time. So the Mombasa invitation comes first. And the fact that he accepts after conferring with his guru, also sort of the word of that spreads as well. But to go to Mombasa, there's visa formalities that needs to be taken care of, and they take quite a while. Now, before his visa to Mombasa can actually be delivered, the Jain Sangh in Aden has learned of the fact that a mendicant has said yes to an invitation to preach overseas. So they extend an invitation, and because Aden, not at that time, but until less than 10 years before, was actually governed as part of the Mumbai presidency, the visa formalities were much less stringent. So he actually ends up going to Aden while waiting for his visa to Mombasa. He boards the steamer a second time and crosses the ocean a second time in September 46. And this is how he arrives in East Africa. When they woke up in the morning, everyone was trying to catch a glimpse of Kilindi Harbor in the distance. When I woke up, I too remembered that we would reach Mombasa today, and I too tried to see our destination from within the cabin. It was drizzling outside, and in the dim light, the buildings and the harbor front appeared within my sight. Along with my brother, who's traveling with one other yati, I started to pack. At 6 in the morning, the steamer moored at Kilindi Harbor, and I felt the cables being stretched. At the harbor, the leader and members of the Sri Stanakwasi Jain Sangh were present to welcome me. It was raining heavily, But this did not seem to burden the hearts of the people. Indeed, I was very happy to see many brothers and sisters on this occasion. As soon as I put my feet on solid ground, the celebration started. So I'll briefly present the communities he visits and how they developed in the places that they did. So Jains and other Indian communities have been present in East Africa for a good long while. But for most of history, almost all migration around that Western Indian Ocean was circular migration, meaning that people involved in trade would venture out Persian Gulf, Gulf of Aden, East Africa in one season, and then come back carrying other goods back to India a few months later, depending on the monsoon winds and currents. In the 19th century, this starts to change, the pattern changes, and more, we see more and more pockets of settled migration. And the number of people settling, so number of people from India settling around this Western Indian Ocean also increases. Now, why does this change? This has to do with modes of transport and availability of alternative modes of transport, so alternative to the dhow. But it also has a lot to do with colonialism and empire. Because we see that on the other side, sort of non-Indian side of the Western Indian Ocean, the British gain more and more territory, more and more colonies, which they seek to build up and, it's colonialism, exploit, right? So Aden becomes theirs quite early, even under the East Indian Company, and is then, as I said, under the Bombay Presidency until 1937, governed directly from there. So it's governed as a part of British India for the longest time. Zanzibar becomes a British protectorate in 1890, closely followed by the East African Protectorate, which will become Kenya in 1995, the Protectorate of Uganda even 1 year earlier in 1994. And then Tanganyika was first German East Africa, but after the First World War, or during the First World War, comes under British influence in 1916. So because of this, because it's all kind of part of this British Empire, groups of people move. Let me try to kind of give you a bit of a structured view of this. So you have British and other European settlers in these East African protectorates, more and more. You have an emerging local economy, but to the sentiment of the British, this emerging local economy needs help. It needs people with a head for business to come in and sort of help make this into a sort of a monetary economy rather than an economy of barter, which is a process that in India had begun much earlier, and so they know how to work with these Indian traders. There's also a lot of indentured labor. Indentured labor, the British have abolished formal slavery, but they've thought of this system, which other colonial nations also use, of kind of usually 5-year contracts, which brings mostly Indian laborers to these other colonies, to plantations as far as Mauritius and Fiji, but also and in force to East Africa to construct infrastructure like railways, roads, etc. Now, some of these indentured laborers stay and settle in the place that they initially came to work temporarily. And this is also quite a sizable group. And together, these European settlers, this local economy, these indentured laborers, and these post-indentured settlers make up quite an interesting sort of market. And it is this market, this group of people with demands for food and utensils and everything, which also really accelerates independent migration to these East African protectorates. And it's in this independent migration that we need to look for the Jains. Not necessarily that they come as very rich businessmen, but they do migrate to East Africa, mostly to set up businesses to cater to this newly emerged market that they are actually quite well placed to cater to, because they know of the cultural background of these indentured laborers and post-indentured settlers, and they are more used than the local African communities to dealing with the British and the Europeans. So this picture is a picture of indentured laborers working on the lunatic line, which was the Mombasa-Kampala railway line, which was constructed and finalized around 1900. About 32,000 Indian laborers worked on that. It cost the life of at least 2,500, because it was truly a lunatic project through deep jungle with a lot of lions, etc. But this kind of explains how there's a big Indian community in East Africa, and the reason why Jain traders also increasingly went there and migrate in a more settled way. Now, if we look at how these communities develop, it's really, I mean, and this won't be a big surprise to many of you, it kind of follows a pattern of sorts. Mainly, first, a sentinel migrant is sent out by a family, or sometimes we have accounts of an entire village sort of chipping in to buy a ticket for one of their own to go and set up a business. And then in the second wave, when this business is successful, which often it is, but sometimes it isn't, we also have cases of these sentinel migrants just coming back, having to save up money to be able to come back to India. When there's some success, the second wave of migration follows, and then usually it's a brother or a nephew or someone else of the village coming to join this business. So it grows quite gradually at first. The first Jains that we know of to be in East Africa are just at the end of the 19th century, and a few more coming in the beginning of the 20th. And then the growth is quite gradual until sort of the interbellum, let's say. And then we see more movement, more things happening. Now, why do we see more things happening? Because as this group, which is initially gender-wise quite male, because they're the traders, they're the ones conducting the business, this group grows and realizes that they are there for a longer period of time. It doesn't necessarily have to be forever, ever in their minds at that time, but that they will lead a more or less settled life there. Wives come into the picture. Children are brought up. You see here in the picture the family of Keshevji Parbat, who arrived in Kenya in 1905 as one of the first. His family picture in the 40s, this says circa 1940, but with the amount of grandchildren in the picture, that can't really check out. So it's probably a little bit later. It's probably around the time that the author of our travelogue travels there. Anyway, you see children that have been born to these Jain communities in East Africa. And the moment you have not only the traders focused on their business, but also the families, the wives, the children having to sort of have some upbringing and some notion of sort of cultural background and religious values, community organizations emerge rather rapidly. And with community organizations comes in a slightly later phase, infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning temples, but also cultural centers, Mahajanwadis, schools are set up as these businesses are more and more successful, and as these communities become more wealthy, they develop their own educational infrastructure, their own medical infrastructure, sports infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. In the travelogue, we read about the type of people that the Yati Hemchandra encounters, and just very general, about Mombasa says there's Kuchis, there's Kathiawaris, and there's Gujaratis. And on the whole, we can actually say that for East Africa, the first migration, mainly to Zanzibar, is mainly from Kutch. Then Kathiawar, and then the Gujaratis. The Gujaratis arrive slightly later than these other groups. But by the time he travels, these are the three communities that he finds. There's also an Indian association of which they are part, and a Mahila Mandal too. The Jain Derasa of Mumbai is a Tiert for the Ravasi brothers living in East Africa. Apart from this, there is the Jain Gyanvardhan Mandal. But it is the Vanik society that is most organized and flexible and organizes Jainism-related activities for the whole Jain society. And then the Vanik society is mostly the Oshawa society, because the majority of Jains then in Mombasa comes from the Oshawa groups from Gujarat. Around Jamnagar. And there's also sort of a smaller Navnat group, which kind of groups other people from that region which do not come from the traditional Oshawa villages. This is probably, someone will be able to nuance this, but that is probably the shortest way to conceptualize this. The travelogue is really interesting because it gives an insight to these communities as they are in full development just after the Second World War. A lot of migration during the World War, things were sort of at a standstill, but a lot of migrations coming in just at the end of the World War and just after. These communities are in full development, organizations are in full development. And it's really interesting to read in detail about how many people are where in which villages, what organizations do what kind of events. It's extra interesting because it's very rare to find information specifically on Jain communities in these places at that time. It's also really interesting because we know that less than 20 years after the Yati's visit, after the situation that is described to us, everything changes. Shifts and a decline of this community is kind of imminent, if you can call it imminent, if there's 20 years to go. The Zanzibar revolution will come, the Aden emergency and then Aden independence will mean the practical end of the Jain community there. The situation in Kenya is going to be difficult throughout the Mau Mau rebellion and the Africanization policies that follow independence. Tanzania will see its socialist reforms and its own brand of Africanization. And then probably the most dire of them all in 1972, the expulsion of South Asians from Uganda by Idi Amin will end the Jain community there for at least 20 years. Now, today, there's again Jains in Uganda, but they are not the same Jains that were there before. In the picture, you see the Sri Kuchi Svetambar Jain temple in Stone Town, Zanzibar, often claimed to be the oldest Jain temple outside of South Asia, but the one in Aden is actually older, but when it was built, it was part of the sort of British India, so it counts and it doesn't count. Either way, this is one of the temples which has a claim to be the oldest, built in 1905. Interestingly, because we're talking about these shifts and the decline of these communities, the Zanzibar revolution kind of ended the Jain community in Zanzibar. And they took the statues, the murtis from this temple, first to Dar es Salaam and then to Nairobi. The community in Zanzibar at that time kind of reconfigured a little bit, merged with the community in Dar es Salaam, but then a few years later, with the reforms in post-independence Tanzania, again, sort of, it didn't disappear, but it was decimated and has definitely changed very much since then. Another picture here, you see a Mahajanvadi Hall in Mbale. It was inaugurated in 1961. But 11 years later, in 1972, when all of the South Asians had to leave Uganda, it was nationalized and was then turned into a school. So this new hall, which was inaugurated with a lot of sort of pride and a lot of happiness, existed for exactly 11 years before everything changed. Right. So after 1972, you see a complete change and a reconfiguration. I'm not going to go into details because I will go over time quite horribly, but it's good to know that, for example, the Jain community in London is the vast majority of them have an East African connection. So this story of Jains in East Africa that I tell now from a point of view of the mid-20th century is still very much relevant in the practices and in the way and in the family histories of Jains in other places in the world today. Also in the travelogue, we see the welcome letter that the Sri Visa Oswal Vanik Society gives to the Yati upon his arrival in Mombasa. I'm not going to read it to you because, again, not enough time. But one of the things they say is, well, clearly here in East Africa, we haven't been able to follow Jainism sort of completely as we should, but we hope that you coming here will set us on the right path, and we are very dedicated to do so. So from this letter, from sort of this idea that, okay, we need your expertise, we need your engagement because we need to be led down the right path, it makes us wonder, what exactly does this Yati Hemchandraji preach? And that's the last thing I will talk to you guys about. It's interesting to see what ideology is in the travelogue. So remember this triad of the Samvegi Sadhus, the Gujarati Yatis and the Marwari Yatis, with sort of mentions of laxity and tantra and allegations of sectarianism and pride on the other side, right? And also remember that we're in the 1940s, world affairs, things are changing rapidly. The invitation comes to the Yati during World War II. He travels just after World War II. We are at that point 1 year before Indian independence. Also, in other places in the world, sort of the struggles for independence and anti-colonial nationalism are on the rise. So things are happening fast. We also see after World War II, this sort of the pre-formation of the Cold War with these two power blocks in the world, communism on one side and the West, and sort of the gradual rise of American power on the other side. So all of that is at the background. And what does then Yati preach? He actually does not go into Jain doctrine much at all. He talks to these communities about non-sectarian Jainism with an emphasis that couldn't be further away from Tantra, from this allegation of Jains meddling in Tantra that he heard from the Samvegi Sadhus. He emphasizes knowledge and social action. The word humanism is probably the most prevalent word in the entire travelogue, and interfaith collaborations. He makes a point of always mentioning the fact that he also is invited very cordially to Muslim homes, to Hindu families, that he also interacts with the local Swahili population. So that is very strongly present, and that is very clearly kind of also a reaction to this, this triad he has going on with the Samvegi Sadhus and the Yatis. Then you also have clear references to independence movements, both in India, of course, very strongly, in Gandhi, but also independence movements going on in other places in the world. So the broader anti-colonialism is quite present there, as is sort of this appeal for solidarity between these colonies and to help each other figure out ways to get back to independence and to get back the values of these ancient civilizations, especially around the Western Indian Ocean. He shares a cabin on the second steamer with a person called Jomo Kenyatta, who will be the first president of independent Kenya, which is a lovely coincidence and very interesting, because they discuss the merits of Marxism and Gandhian nationalism. And it's very clear throughout the travelogue that there are nods to socialism and Marxism, not necessarily that Yati Hemchandra himself preaches overt Marxism or socialism, but he does let Jomo Kenyatta tell his story and kind of talk up the merits of communism without really going against him. So these are another few excerpts. Let me see how badly I'm going over time. But he talks about the lust for empire that grows and the sting of selfishness fell on the world. Human civilizations were destroyed for status and profit. The selfishness of man undermined culture, and the entire world got caught up in this current. So it's, again, this gives you an idea of, it's very eloquently written, quite strong, and not just on the level of let's get the British out, but on the level of how to think of culture, civilization, and the passing of time. Anti-sectarianism is very present. He, of course, writes, but when he travels, he is invited to Gandhi Jayanti celebrations, but Gandhi is still alive at that time. But by the time he writes about these Gandhi Jayanti celebrations he attends in Nairobi, I think, Gandhi has been assassinated. And there he writes, we should not be swept away in the stream of sectarianism and lose our sense of humanity. There we are again with the humanism and humanity. Just because we believe our principles are true and beautiful does not mean we should impose them. And at the same time, we should learn to cultivate moral courage so that if something seems to be true, we can accept it. Even though it may be a truth that shatters our preconceived notions. Truth is hard to contemplate, digest, and embrace, but only this is the right way to live. I'm going to skip this to get to the conclusion, and also because I want to read you a last excerpt before we conclude. So in conclusion, I'm just very happy to share these glimpses of ongoing research with you guys. So I don't have a broad conclusion yet. I'm in the middle of this and I'm very excited to read and learn more. But what I can say is that we see in this travelogue a unique intersection of events. We're in kind of the final decline of the Yati order, but still we see this narrative which is presented very strongly. We get an idea of this developing Jain diaspora in the 40s, which is really when the diaspora as we know it now got going. We see these independence movements on both sides of the Western Indian Ocean, and we see different anti-colonial ideologies, some more communist inclined, some more sort of cultural nationalist inclined. We see them interwoven in this tale. It's also interesting to link this to ongoing concerns about mendicants traveling, about sort of the essence of the role of the mendicant in Jainism. Is there a need for outreach to lay populations? Should Jain mendicants be present in the world like this, or should they focus on their own individual spiritual progress, which from certain perspectives is the essence of being a mendicant? That is why you do it. You retreat from the world, then why go out in it? And it is also really one of the only sources to study Jainism in East Africa before the 1950s. So as sort of a closing statement, I want to read you one last bit of this travelogue where, and it's one of the instances where we see that Jain doctrine and moksha does every so often enter into the story. Above was the sky and below was the sea. In between the two, our steamer crossed. Near the shore, the water had been yellow and dirty, but here the currents were crystal black. I gazed at them before heading to my cabin for a long rest. The steamer rocked and made us sway, and the swaying also brought us peace. I lay in bed, and the waves of my thoughts rose in my mind like the waves of the sea. Isn't the world just like the ocean? It is infinite, it has storms and tempests, and our lives are being propelled by its turns. As the steamer is dry, so our soul is dry. And it too must cross the ocean and visit the different ports along its shores to finally reach the peaceful place of its final destination and enter the kingdom of moksha. But what if the steamer goes down in a sudden storm along the way? What if the soul gets stranded in this life? Can the steamer take the same way back? And how long will the journey take? Can anyone really make it to the other shore? I closed my eyes. I fell asleep with the sea rocking me like a small child. And that is where I will leave it. Thank you very much for bearing with me through my excitement about this ongoing project.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, really innovative. We never heard so many details of African Jains or Jains. I thought only Kenya had some Jains. I think Kanji Swami had gone to Kenya and there was a temple.
Yeah, he did in 1980. It's the only overseas visit he did.
So much we learned today. Thank you so much. We have a hand raised by Mr. Siddharth Shahi. So let's see what he has to ask or mention. Oh, yeah, Siddharth. Go ahead, please. Siddharth Shahi. His hand is still up. Okay. Meanwhile, anybody else would like to ask or comment? Welcome to ask here. Yeah. Meanwhile, you can tell us more. How many countries in Africa today have Jain temples?
Today there's quite a few Jain temples. So Mombasa, they built one in the 60s. Well, let me start. So they got a first building built early on in the 20s, where they could gather, and they had a small temple, but it wasn't a Shikarbandi temple. It wasn't an Indian style temple. Now in the 60s they built the first one, Shwetambar Deravasi. And then in the 80s, they built a new one. And the one that is now usually sort of referred to as the Mombasa Temple is the one that was built in the 80s. There is one in Nairobi as well, also from the early 80s, if I'm not much mistaken. The temple in Zanzibar is still there, and I hope to visit it early next year. It is not a day-to-day functioning temple, but the Dar es Salaam Jain Sangh actually goes there, I think on 2 occasions for festivals, to do some pujas and to have some events there. So it is, you can visit it, but it's not so that there's no daily puja going on. That's also Shwetambar temple. So the Digambar temple there is, not in Zanzibar. There's definitely one in Mombasa, and there's also one in Nairobi. I would have to look into the dates for that, but it's quite late. Because the Digambar group there was quite small until Kanji Swami came. Well, not till he came there, but until Kanji Swami and his reform movement became more popular in Gujarat. And from then you see that there's more and more sort of Digambar Jains identifying with this Digambar ideology in East Africa. So a lot of them actually internally converted from sort of being Shwetambar Oswals to Digambar Oswals, to these Mumukshus following Kanji Swami. And then in Kampala, in Uganda, you had a temple which was no more after 72. So all of that was nationalized. I'm assuming that there's probably a place of worship there now. But again, Jains only came back to Kampala in the 90s. So I'm not entirely sure of that. Dar es Salaam has temples as well, probably a Shwetambar and Digambar. And then there's community halls. The Mahanjawadis are dotted around the place. So even quite small villages in Kenya, as soon as there were sort of 5-6 families, they would try to set up a hall, because on the whole, these communities did really well. So they did become from quite humble beginnings. They did become quite wealthy, and then this is one of the things that they would invest in, and that they would try to construct. So like the one in Mbale in Uganda that we saw in the picture, that's a small community. I think there were only 150 Jains there, but still they sort of got up to building this and sort of gathering money for this to have a place where they could meet.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other question from anyone else?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, Siddharth has typed his question. Okay.
Wait, let me see. Okay, I'm wondering if this is more a question for Eva. Differentiation within the Rāmāyaṇa in Hinduism and Jainism, with Jainism being a pant, another religion in itself. Okay, I can sort of I can talk about this, but I think it's more a question for Eva. So if Eva is still here.
Okay, I was talking about Jain temples. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can
Yeah,
hear
yeah,
you.
okay. So I've been to Europe and some parts of the Oriental nations, basically, and stayed in Gujarat or as well. And I've been to a lot of their research. So, what do you think about the sculpture and the architecture difference which you see, like the impact of Oriental countries on the Jain architecture, as well as the sculpture out there in the Malaysian and Singaporean side, as well as the European impact on the Derasars you see in Europe and
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting question. I must say I haven't been to Malaysia or Singapore myself. We have a PhD student who will leave in 5 days from Belgium to go and explore Jainism in Southeast Asia. So I'll get back to you when next we meet. I will have an opinion about this. But about Europe and the US, I can sort of talk about this a little bit. So you have different things. When Jains first sort of started coming to, for example, the UK in a larger group, people didn't really think about building like a traditional Jain temple. So they would just try to get a building. In Leicester, for example, in the UK, it's a church. It's a former church to house a temple in. So there you see it's very clearly Western architecture. But on the inside, the most sort of sculpture, etc., is imported from India. So you have nods to traditional architecture without it actually the building being at all Jain or Indic or anything really. But then as these communities grow, and especially if they're quite wealthy, you do find sort of this urge to get more traditional buildings going on. And you also see that in the newer temples, so from the 60s and the 80s in East Africa, that they're built usually sort of to the example of the temples that are found in Gujarat and the south of Rajasthan. Yeah. The one in Antwerp, for example, is actually it's 12th to 13th century Gujarati temple, white marble. It just is. It has very few nods to European influence. It's very clearly sort of thought through. They want to be as close to traditional temple architecture as they can. And you see that in some places in the US as well. It just really depends on how wealthy a community is. And also how how sort of the internal demographics are. So it's very clear in Antwerp, this is a predominantly Gujarati community. It's a diamond community. They have a lot of money. They went for as traditional as we can get, Gujarati style mandir. Right. But if you have a community which has more Jains from Karnataka, for example, and a mix of Rajasthani and Gujarati, then it becomes more of a challenge to figure out what exactly you want to build. So the Oswald Center Temple in London, for example, is also quite a traditional temple. Also, although they have decided to add a lift, add an elevator. But it's sort of in the red sandstone building material that you see. It's not the white marble. In Antwerp, they really very clearly went for the white marble. And in the US, where these communities are usually more diverse, you see that the building is pretty much standard Western, but there is a love to make it shikarbandi. So you often have like a Western building style box house, really, with then the shikar on top. Right. I don't know if that answers your questions. These were some of my thoughts.
Right.
Okay, any other question for anybody else? If not, yeah, Sanjay. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Yeah, I hope I have not missed this part, but I was wondering, in Hindus, we have this notion of, or rather, we had this notion of purity and pollution when one crosses the ocean or the seas. So I was wondering whether this kind of notion was there amongst the Jain mendicants also.
Oh, it's definitely there. So if you look at sort of Jain doctrine, it's very difficult to pinpoint it. It's not necessarily in those texts, but it is kind of this trepidation, this idea of not to cross the black water, right? Is definitely, it's culturally there, right? Without wanting to go into the discussion whether Jainism is a separate tradition or sort of yeah, part of Hinduism, which was referred to in Siddharth's other question. It's definitely there. It's culturally there. This is the black water, right? Both for mendicants and for lay people. And now mendicants traditionally wouldn't travel by a mechanical means, so they wouldn't get on a boat anyway. So it's these yattis, and then later on from the 70s, some individual mendicants starting to make an exception. But usually they wouldn't travel at all. So then it's less of an issue because, you know, they would, their vows wouldn't allow them anyway. But even for lay people, it's a big step. It's a big step, and then for Jains, it's not necessarily framed in sort of purity, impurity, but it's just very practically, how are you going to do your daily rituals? How are you going to keep to a strict Jain vegetarian diet if you're going to go do this? But for the people who left from Kutch, and definitely the ones from Gujarat, they left at a time when the monsoon had not been good. They weren't really doing great. The situation there, something had to give. At the very least, there was not a lot of opportunity for the younger generations to really do anything. So making that step was necessary. And if you look at individual like autobiographies and accounts of people that actually left, it's very much framed as an adventure. The thoughts of, you know, what are you going to do, and purity, and what are you going to eat, they're there in the accounts of the mothers they leave behind, and of sort of the village leaders that say, oh, be careful. But in the minds of these people that are going to be these pioneering immigrants there, it's very much an adventure, and it's also very much a necessity. They weren't that well off when they left. And in many cases, in 1 or 2 generations, they turned it around completely. They became really wealthy, and they could, they were one of the communities that very early on went all out for education. They educate both their sons and their daughters, sent everyone to universities in London and back to Mumbai and all that. So it was a gamble. There was a lot of trepidation there, but it needed to be done. And it was also very much an adventure.
So I think this also brings us back to the question of lemons, because they didn't have anything to eat, and so the lemons.
Lemons.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Anything else? Anybody else? I think that's it. So, Sanchari, you can take care of the closing now.
Okay, sure. So firstly, thank you all for joining us on this incredible journey. Thank you, Professors Eva, Professor Tine. This was a very enlightening way of knowing about the Jain history, and especially for someone like me, who is not a scholar of Jain history, but still I got to know so many things through this webinar. And thank you, Professor Pankaj Jain, for organizing this webinar. And so thank you, everyone. See you. Bye.
Thank you, Sanchari. Thank you, Pankaj.
Bye.